One of my wife Vanessa's favorite songs. Vanessa's in Mississippi taking care of our grandkids this week. So I get to use her as an example today. She's not here. But one of her favorite songs is I Can Only Imagine, sung by Mercy Me. And I can tell by some of the reaction of some of you that you know that song. You know that Bart Millard, the lead singer of Mercy Me, invites us to envision what our first encounter will be like with Jesus when we meet him face to face in eternity. Can I say to us, I don't think we have to wait until we get to heaven to imagine. So I want to take a moment and invite you to take a moment this morning and just imagine, if you would, in this moment, what you are going to feel, what you are going to do in that moment when you meet Jesus face to face, when your life is here on earth is over, and you arrive in his presence. Take a moment and think about that. Having thought about that, I want to invite you to turn to the person next to you. If you came with someone, tell them what it is that you think you're going to be doing, what that moment's going to be like for you. Take a moment and do that, would you? Right now. Okay, thanks for doing that this morning. And you know, as I thought about that this week, what came to my mind was this picture. And this is an artist's rendition that he titles First Day in Heaven. And this was a picture that I sent to our family and our friends the day after I had been sitting there in that hospital room with my sister there in Springfield, Missouri, holding her hand, singing songs with her, reading scriptures to her as she took her last breath and entered into the presence of Jesus after having died from COVID. And as I think about this picture, I think that this is a representation of my sister. In that first moment when she saw Jesus face to face. And as I think about this, it helps me to understand more deeply what Mary of Bethany was feeling. In that first part of the story that Jason read a few moments ago from John chapter 12, a story that we looked at in depth last week. As Mary pours her heart out to Jesus, she's extravagant with him in her worship of him. She doesn't hold back in expressing worship of him, much like I think what we're going to do when we meet Jesus face to face in heaven. And so I want to encourage you, if you did not hear that message last week, would you go online sometime, watch it on our YouTube video or Facebook page, listen to it. It's a wonderful story that speaks to us about our life and about our priorities and the way we can worship Jesus. Well, as we circle back to this text again this week, along with looking at the next events that John talked about there in verses 12 through 19, I want to encourage us to ask ourselves what we would have done in worship of Jesus if we were with him back then, when Mary was with him there in their home, or if we were part of the crowd there in Jerusalem that day when Jesus entered the city riding on the donkey on that day that we call Palm Sunday, but literally back then was actually Lamb Selection Sunday. In John chapter 12, verses 12 through 15, John tells us about the day after that dinner in Bethany where Mary had anointed Jesus with nard. And John writes this: the next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival, meaning the festival of Passover, heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And they took palm branches and they went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. And Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. For as it is written, do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. What's going on there on that Lamb Selection Sunday? Well, that's a day that all of the Jewish people were in the city to buy their Passover lamb that they were going to use for the celebration of Passover. Passover, remember, for those of you maybe who are unchurched or not familiar with the stories of the Old Testament, is an event that the Jewish people had celebrated every year of their lives, as they had celebrated God delivering his people, the people of Israel, from slavery in Egypt some 1,400 years before, when God had sent Moses to the Pharaoh of Egypt and said, hey, let my people go. And when Pharaoh refuses, God sends 10 plagues on the nation of Egypt, with the 10th one, each of them getting more severe, and the 10th one being the angel of death passing over the nation, and every firstborn male there in Egypt dies, except those who had followed God's instruction. Those who had sacrificed the Passover lamb and had put the blood of the lamb over the mantle of their home, the doors and the doorposts, and roasted the lamb and ate it in order to give them strength for the exodus out of Egypt when Pharaoh would finally let God's people go. And whoever had the lamb over the lamb's blood over the doors of their home, the angel of death would pass over that home, and the life of the firstborn male in that home was spared. And that's the festival that Jesus and his followers are going to celebrate that week there in Jerusalem. And they're going 4 days ahead of that festival because God had also instructed his people when he instructed them to celebrate Passover. He said, I want you to go and buy the lamb 4 days ahead and pick out that lamb, take it home with you, care for it, get close to it, because God wanted them to understand the cost that there was for them to have their life spared by the blood of that lamb. And of course, all of that pointed to Jesus. All of that points to Jesus, who is our Passover lamb, who died on the cross for you and for me, who shed his blood for us, taking on the consequences of your sin and mine so that we could have life, so that we could have forgiveness of sin, so that we could live life here on earth, not in bondage or oppression to slavery like the people were in Egypt back then, but in bondage and slavery to sin. We can be free from that, and we can ultimately experience eternal life with God and with Jesus in heaven when life is over here on earth for us, and it's because of God's grace and mercy. And so like Mary in verses 1 through 11 of John 12, and like the people back then in Jerusalem in verses 12 through 19, what is it that you and I would have done to show our love for him as our Messiah, as our Savior? And last week, we talked about Mary's extravagant gift and what that was and what it meant, her extravagant gift in worshiping Jesus and how she did not hold back in her worship of him. And it shows us how we, as God's people today, can be worshiping him. And so remember, as we said last week, as we see here on the screen, when we worship Jesus, we don't calculate the cost of it to us. But like Mary of Bethany, we realize what? That's right. No gift is too extravagant, and we do not hold back as we worship him. And thinking about what we learned from Mary's example as of her worship last week, we move to the next event that John records for us. And we see a whole different motivation for why the people in Jerusalem were worshiping him back then. You see, Jesus is coming into Jerusalem at a time when many scholars think the city had a population of about 50,000 people. But Passover was one of those festivals where God said, hey, I want every Jewish male in the nation to go to Jerusalem and celebrate this. And so they're thinking that probably the population of Jerusalem that day was another 100,000 people. It had tripled in size. And so the city couldn't contain the population. And as a result, thousands of people are camped out on the hillside surrounding the city. And with the size of a crowd like that, it brought a lot of tension, right? It brought a lot of tension to the leadership of the city, because they knew that any social disruption could end up with the Roman army coming down on them. And that's what they're fearing that day when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem and the people are waving palm branches and they're shouting Hosanna, or in our English it's one word, Hosanna. In Aramaic it's Hosanna, two words, because they understood what was going on that day. They understand that the palm branches that the people are waving there in verse 13 were abundant in Israel, and they had become a symbol of Jewish nationalism. I don't know if you know this, but there was a terrorist group that lived there in Israel, and they were called the Zealots. They were the terrorists of the day, and they would kill Roman soldiers whenever they had the opportunity to do so, and they would even kill their own people who sympathized with the Roman government if they could. And they had taken the palm branch as their symbol, much like political parties today have taken the symbol of the elephant or the donkey. And during both of the major wars that happened with Rome, they stamped on coins the palm branch. The rebels would mint coins and stamp the palm branch on it. And so the palm symbolized Israel's national hopes, which they were now focusing on Jesus, because what they were doing that day was they were hailing him as a conquering king as he enters the city. And the word in Aramaic, Hosanna, those two words means save us. And so by waving the palm branches and shouting save us, they're saying, Jesus, our Messiah, save us. In other words, save us from the Romans. More literally, kill the Romans. You see, the crowds are greeting Jesus as a national liberator. It was like other triumphal entries that were common in that day in the ancient world, when conquering kings would return to their cities as a hero, and they would bring the spoils of battle, and they would bring the stories of conquest. And so the imagery of Jesus coming into the city that day with the people waving the palm branches and shouting Hosanna could not be missed by anyone living in the Roman Empire. And when John says there in that text that the crowds went out to meet him, that was a common expression, an idiom in that day that meant what would happen when people of a city would go out and meet the returning, conquering hero who had come back from battle. And so this scene is filled with Jewish political fervor. Now, it's interesting that Jesus comes riding into the city on what? A donkey, right? I mean, most kings in that day would come riding in on a chariot, or they'd come riding in on a white stallion. They would be coming in with a war horse. They'd come in with swords and with bows. But Jesus comes on a donkey. Why? Because he is coming to bring peace to all nations. He is not coming to conquest. He is coming to bring peace. Now, his second coming, when he comes back at the end of time as we know it, will be a time to bring about judgment. But his first coming is about bringing peace and life, not conquest, to nations. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's forcing a messianic reinterpretation of his reason of why he's come to earth. He's not come to bring salvation to the people from their Roman oppressors or from their slavery to Rome. Instead, he's coming to bring salvation to people from their bondage and slavery to sin, in their life and in your life and in my life. And he's fulfilling that prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, which prophesies about the coming king, about the coming Messiah, when Zechariah says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes riding to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of the donkey." And as we see this event that John records here in his gospel story, I've got to say to us this morning, do you notice the difference that there is in the way that Mary worshiped Jesus that we talked about last week and the way the crowds are worshiping Jesus here in this story? And the difference is that Mary is worshiping Jesus for who he is. She's letting him define who he is and what he's about, whereas the crowds on that Lamb Selection Sunday, or what we now call Palm Sunday, were worshiping him for who they wanted him to be. And you know, I think that's in a way why a lot of theologians will talk about how worship can be really a dangerous act for us, huh? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but worship really can be one of the more dangerous things that you and I do spiritually. Because when we come to this place of worship to worship God, we enter a realm of risk. And that risk comes not from God, but it comes from ourselves. When we worship, we cross over into territory where what? It comes from God and not from ourselves. Now, what do we mean when I say that? When the theologians say that, what do they mean? Well, it means we run the risk of approaching God in a way that is not pleasing to him. And there are times when God is not pleased with the worship of his people. I mean, I think of Isaiah 29, verse 13, where the Lord says, these people come to me with their mouth and they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me. Their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught. And Jesus quotes this text in Mark 7 when he talks about the people in his day. And it says that he replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, and their teachings are merely human rules. And so as we think about this, what does this say to your life and to me today? What's a faith lesson here for us as we look at these two events from John 12, the event we looked at last week in Mary's worship to Jesus, and the event that we are looking at today of everyone else's worship to Jesus. And last week I said to you, hey, sometimes preaching, comforts the afflicted, but sometimes it afflicts the comfortable. And last week certainly got us out of our comfort zones. Can I say to us today as we go on now to look at this, put on your seatbelts, buckle up, strap it on, because the reality is, what's the lesson in this about the risk that we run into when we worship Jesus? Well, I want to say to us, first of all, I think we run the risk of dishonest worship. We run the risk of dishonest worship. What that means is that whenever we approach God in worship, we can be tempted to come to him wearing our masks, right? We come to church a lot, don't we, wearing our masks. We are tempted to approach God not as we are, but as we want others to see us, as we want God to see us. Which is why I have oftentimes said, and you've heard me if you've been around here for a while, I wish the church could really become like Alcoholics Anonymous. Because those of you that are part of AA, you know how do they start their meeting? My name is David and I'm an alcoholic, right? They confess those things. And I'm not an alcoholic, but if I were to confess, I could say, hey, my name is David, and in my past, I've experienced an addiction to pornography, and I've shared my story with you of how God broke me free from that. But I tell you, it's an ongoing wrestle, and I got to have accountability people around me, and I do. I have that accountability built into my life. I have those people around me who I can go to and say, hey, I'm tempted. I have a guy in Olathe who I can call at 2 o'clock in the morning if need be. And that's what the Church of Jesus Christ is supposed to be about. Not that we come here pretending to be somebody that we're not. Because when we do that, our worship really of God is dishonest. I mean, think about it. Contrast that to Mary's worship that is so open and so real and so transparent. We talked about that last week, how she let her hair down and she anoints Jesus and she wipes his feet with her hair. And by doing so, she offends Judas and she offends just about everybody else in the room. Except for Jesus, of course. Because remember, as we saw last week, that setting where they're reclining at the table and Mary comes in and in an extravagant way. Look at verse 3 again, chapter 12, verse 3. Then Mary takes a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and she pours it on Jesus' feet, and she wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. And I think this is a picture of really true, honest worship. It's a perfect paradigm for true worship because Mary is taking her place at Jesus' feet. She realizes her place there as his disciple at the feet of Jesus. And not only does she make herself his servant, but she makes herself lower than a servant, because in that day when people washed the feet of others, which was a tradition and a habit that they did when they entered the house in this hot, dusty climate without shoes and that kind of thing, sandals, there was a servant there who would wash the feet of the person coming into the house. But when they dried their feet, they used a towel. Mary goes even greater than that. She wipes his feet with her hair, which, if you understand hair in that day, as we talked about last week, symbolized her glory as a woman. She, in a sense, is casting her glory, herself, at the feet of Jesus, which reminded me this week as I was putting this message together, that great text in Revelation where it says that we're going to receive crowns in heaven, but when we look at Jesus, we're going to cast our crowns at his feet. And that's what Mary is doing. She's casting her glory, her crown, at the feet of Jesus. And obviously, as we saw, what she did shocked the people back then. Because in that day, a woman never let her hair down in public. The only people that ever saw a woman with her hair down was her family and her husband. And so what Mary is doing scandalizes everyone in the room, because she is worshiping with total transparency. And I've got to say, if we were to come and worship Jesus with total transparency here, it might scandalize some people around us, wouldn't it? If they knew who we really were and what was going on inside of us at times, because we are all sinners in need of grace.
At this point in the service this week, the pastor's microphone lost power. Here is the rest of David's message.
But Judas is disingenuous. And he gives a disturbingly reasonable explanation for his dismay in verses 4 through 5. Look at it as it comes on the screen. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." Now you got to admit, he kind of builds a persuasive case, doesn't he? I mean, who can argue with him? But in reality, he's a man in disguise. He's wearing a mask, because verse 6 says he did not say this because he cared about the poor. Oh, that's his reason that he gives. But his real reason is because he's a thief. And as a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. What's going on here is Judas is being dishonest at every level. He doesn't care about the poor. He doesn't care about propriety. He doesn't care about Jesus. His devotion and his worship, his reason for worship, is a masquerade compared to Mary, who doesn't hold back in her devotion. And so I got to ask us today, as we think about this, do you and I come to worship at times wearing a mask? Do we hold back when we worship Jesus? Do we worry about what other people might think about us? Or can we come to worship admitting who we are, and then, because of God's grace and mercy that is so overwhelming, his love for us, we can then pour our heart out in worship, joyfully and eagerly, not reluctantly, not holding back. And the Bible is full of instruction like this. Psalm 100, verses 1 and 2, "Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs." Psalm 122:1, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord.'" And then I love this one, Psalm 149, because this would freak us out if we ever did this. "Let them praise his name with dancing and make music to him with the timbrel and the harp." I mean, what would it be like if we got up and we really gave ourselves in worship, right? I mean, as we think about that and how we come to worship, can I compare that with how we act and behave at a sporting event? How many of you have been to a football game at KU or K-State or Mizzou or Pittsburgh State, or you've been to Arrowhead for a football game, or you've been to the Royals game at the K? How do people come into the game? "Oh, I got to go to a game." No, they are pumped up. They are excited. Before the game, everybody's standing and hooping and hollering. I mean, they are really into it with all their heart. That's why they're called fans. It comes from the word fanatic. When you and I come to worship, Is that how we come to worship? Coming to worship and engaging a living God with every part of who we are? Is our heart engaged? Are we honest with God and others about who we are and why we're here instead of wearing a mask? Mary's shameless honesty in worship stands out to us in comparison to the duplicity of Judas. When Mary comes to Jesus, she leaves her mask at the door. She's utterly transparent in her approach. And I got to say, I'll at least admit for myself, this is up between you and God what you do with this, but I have to say, I find I need her example. I need her example for my own life because it helps me to strip away my mask and my inhibitions in worship of Jesus. Well, there's another risk that we face, another danger when we move into worship, and that is the danger of calculated worship. Not only is there the danger of dishonest worship, but there's the danger of calculated worship. And what does that mean? Well, we see it in Judas, right? And we see it in the people who are lining the streets of Jerusalem that day to hail Jesus as their Messiah as he rides in on a donkey. And they are treading on dangerous ground because they have moved into the realm of what we would call today calculated worship. And that is a territory that you and I in our day know very well because we cross into it every time we approach God in worship with the mindset of what am I going to get out of this experience? What am I going to get out of worship? And when we approach God that way, it means that our worship is really not for him. It's not about him. It's about us. And while in a sense, yes, worship is for us, as we pray that God will speak into our hearts and lives, we pray that he will fill us with his spirit. The problem is that our self-concern when we come into worship can at times degenerate into self-absorption. I don't know about you, but I look at my own life and I realize there are times when I'm narcissistic about in my worship. It's the value that I get out of it rather than the value that others get out of it or the value that God gets out of it. And that's what happened back then in John chapter 12, that event that John is talking about. Judas rejected what Mary had done as true worship. Why? Because he calculated worship in terms of his own personal gain. Look at verse 5 again. His objection. Why wasn't this perfume sold and given to the poor? It's worth a year's wages. But again, his next verse discloses his real motive. He doesn't care about this because of the poor, but because he was a thief, because he used to help himself to what was in the money bag. And Mark 14, verse 4, sharing the same story, provides an additional detail when it says that some were indignantly remarking to one another, why has this perfume been wasted? So it wasn't just Judas, it was others in the room as well. And they're watching Mary worship, and they are concluding, what a waste. And why was it a waste? Well, it was a waste to Judas because he got nothing out of it. And the rest of the disciples, taken in by that masquerade, reckoned her worship to be invalid for another reason, and it was because it wasn't doing others any good, which is why Jesus is correctly assessing the situation, and he says in verse 7, leave her alone. And as we saw last week, he was saying something my mother always taught me never to say. My mother always said, never say the word shut up. But that's essentially what Jesus is saying here. That's a very strong expression if you look at it in the Greek. Leave her alone. He's saying, shut your mouth. Why? It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You'll always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. And Judas and the disciples aren't the only ones who missed the mark here. Notice what verse 9 says. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and they came. But they didn't come to worship him. They came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. In other words, the party is for Jesus. But a lot of the people are showing up there for somebody else. And I think if we're honest, we could say that's true of our worship as well. And that's also what happened with the people who were lining the streets there when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. I mean, they are worshiping him and they are proclaiming him to be their Messiah on Sunday. And by Friday, many of them are calling for his execution on a cross because he didn't give them what they wanted when they worshiped him. And as I think about that, I realize the dangers for me when I come into worship of God. I realize that danger. And I realize the danger that we make if we are constantly making judgments about either more modern or popular worship compared to traditional worship practices, and we're on one side or the other of that. And I think that when we do that, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, if I get something out of worship, then it's good worship. If I didn't get anything out of it, then it really is lame worship. And I got to say to us that such a perspective is really entirely self-centered. It leaves God out of the equation. It leaves the rest of the congregation out of the equation. And it certainly leaves out of the equation the people out there in the world who we want to come here and have them get to know Jesus. It becomes very self-centered. But we're also not just self-centered maybe, but maybe there are others who oftentimes evaluate worship based like the disciples, who were not necessarily thinking of themselves. At least they weren't going there like Judas, but they were thinking about others. And I think we do the same thing today when we say, hey, is our worship going to help grow the church numerically? Does our worship suit the market? Is it competitive in terms of what other churches do and what other churches have to offer? And I could say, well, at least the disciples, that's an improvement over the other approach that's just totally, completely self-centered. But really, either way, it's a human-centered type of worship rather than a theocentric type of worship. And I think we do that sometimes too, just as the people in Jerusalem got it wrong that day. Oh, we know who he is. We have the perspective of hindsight, 2020, knowing for sure who he is. So our issue isn't that we don't understand who he is. I think our issue is that sometimes we have the wrong perspective and we approach worship like a consumer. I mean, think about it. Have you ever done what I've done at times? And I've gone home and I've said to Vanessa, hey, how was worship today? Huh? What did you think of the music? Was the message interesting? Do you think the service was too long? Well, yeah, you get a few laughs out there. Some of you have had those conversations. I know. And we're thinking at that point about our preferences. And we're thinking about other people's preferences. And I don't know about you, but when I do that, I realize that what that means is that I'm a consumer. I'm a consumer. I mean, when I ask those kinds of questions, it's like when we ask somebody how a restaurant is, how is the food? How was the service? What was the experience like? And what was the atmosphere? And those questions assume basically that I am merely a consumer. And when we ask those questions in the same way about worship, that assumes that we are consumers. When the real questions we need to be asking today is, how well did I worship today? What does God think about my worship? How does God feel about my worship? Did I engage the living God with every part of my being, with my heart, my soul, my strength, my mind? Is God pleased with my worship today? Because worship isn't about you and worship isn't about me. It's about him. You've heard me use this example before, and I want to use it again today. Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish theologian and pastor, I just love some of his writings. And he talks about worship, and he says, so oftentimes we approach worship as if God is the director. The worship leaders up here are the actors, and the congregation is the audience. You're the audience. He says, we get it wrong. True worship is when the worship leaders are the directors, the congregation, you and me, are the actors, and God's the audience. God is the audience. And for years, we've been leaving the presence of Jesus on Sunday mornings asking those questions. What did we get out of that? Or what did the church gain from that? Or did you like it? And I think that Mary's example suggests that, like Judas and like the people in Jerusalem that day, you and I have it backwards when we do that. Yes, we do get something out of worship. James 4:8 says that when we come into God's presence and we draw near to him, he will draw us near to him. And that is an awesome blessing that comes from worship. But ultimately, worship is about what we offer to Jesus. The true value of worship can't be calculated in terms of what you and I take away from it when we walk out the door. The real value of worship is measured by what we leave at Jesus' feet. It is by what we leave at Jesus' feet, like Mary. And so I encourage us, don't come into this place with dishonest worship and calculated worship, but let's come honestly. Let's come knowing it is all about Jesus. And then real briefly before we close, I want to say one more thing that's a danger in terms of how we come to worship, and that is when we come with thoughtless worship. We come with thoughtless worship. When we approach God in worship, we run the risk of coming into worship with our hearts and minds racing with all the stuff that's going on in the world and all the stuff that we've experienced that morning and trying to get our kids and our family to worship. And when we do, we come in sometimes and then our mind is disengaged, isn't it? I'm going to step on toes again this week. I'm going to say what I said last week. Last week, I asked us to consider how when we show up late to worship, what does that say about how we value Jesus? But also in that way, I would say to us today that when we show up late to worship, we can come in racing with just our minds racing, and we're not ready to engage with our thoughts. And so I want to encourage us to come to worship 5-10 minutes early instead of 5 minutes late. Let's get our hearts ready to worship God. Let's start coming to him a little bit earlier so we're not running in here all, crazy with everything going on in the morning, but that we're ready to engage our God with thoughtful rather than thoughtless worship. Because while worship does involve emotion, as we talked about earlier in terms of some of those Psalms, worship also involves a mind, and we see it in the picture of Mary. Her devotion and her worship of Jesus was intense. It was emotionally intense, but it was also engaged with theological truth, because Mary, you see, understood what was going to happen to Jesus, and she understood that he was going to be dying shortly for the sin of the world. And so she then engages him with the theological truth of who he is and what he's about. And she does so, and the disciples, they just don't get it. But Mary does. She grasped the theological truth of the certainty of Jesus' coming death. And so we want to be blending both emotion as well as thought in all that we do in worship. And I want to say to us, as someone who really personally loves and enjoys contemporary worship, I have to admit that there's a lot of contemporary worship, especially years ago, that really didn't engage much thought in theological truth, right? Thankfully that has changed, but there's some worship songs that have about as much musical and theological depth as a commercial jingle. But I'll also say I love traditional worship. And some of you know that my dad studied classical pipe organ at Juilliard School of Music back in the 40s, before World War II. And he was a classical pipe organist. And he played as a pastor in churches. He would oftentimes play songs by Bach, pieces by Bach. And those of you who know Bach, what did Bach write on all of his music? To the glory of God. Sola Dei Gloria. To the glory of God. And so there are two heart languages for worship, these contemporary songs and the traditional songs. And I would say to you, let's not be looking down on one type of worship or another, but let's bring it together and have songs that combine both the emotions that we can pour out to God and worship to him, but also those theological truths. So we don't risk putting our mind on autopilot and worship becoming rote, and so that we can worship him in true worship. John Ortberg warns of these two extremes, and I want to end by saying a few words about what he says. I love John Ortberg. He's a well-known pastor in our country, and he says that he warns of these two extremes we tend to fall in when it comes to worship. He says some churches specialize in generating emotion. The platform people are experts at moving worshipers to laughter or tears. Attenders gradually learn to evaluate the service in terms of the emotion they feel. In time, however, the law of diminishing returns sets in. And prayers are offered in a highly emotive style and bathed in background music. Stories have to get more dramatic. Songs have to become more sentimental. Preaching more histrionic to keep people having intense emotional experiences. And I love it because he uses an illustration familiar to us in Kansas, as he uses the Wizard of Oz as an illustration. And he warns that this kind of worship is often shallow and artificial and rarely reflective, and he calls it scarecrow worship. It would be better if I only had a brain. On the other hand, Ortberg continues, some churches focus keenly on cognitive correctness. They recite great creeds, distribute reams of exegetical information, craft careful prayers ahead of time. And yet the heart and the spirit are not seized with the wonder and the passion that characterize those in Scripture who must fall on their faces when they encounter the living God. And then he says, no one is ever so moved that they actually move. And he says, this is Tin Man worship. If I only had a heart. And I think Mary, who was bowed in humility at the feet of Jesus, shows you and me today a third way to worship, as she is not afraid to bare her heart to her Lord. She is not afraid to express herself in action, but it is action and devotion that is fueled by theological understanding of who Jesus is and what he's about. And so I want to encourage us today to be careful when we worship. Let's come into worship and be careful about it, not rushing headlong into it without considering what we're doing. It's not something we should enter into carelessly. The aim of worship is not to get out of it something that we want, but to give to God something he wants. And when we do that, then by God's grace, something does happen to us. And he draws us to him. And we take that next step in our journey with him. And so as we come to worship, can I encourage us in the weeks and the months ahead to find ourselves face to face with the living God. And when we do, may we find ourselves next to Mary at the feet of Jesus with nothing to offer him but our extravagant devotion, not holding anything back, and giving to him what he would say is true worship.